Shall we start? Hi, everyone. Shall we start? Are people feeling settled, ready to go with their coffees and their waters and anything else they need? Thank you so much for coming today. We had not expected such a high turnout, both in the room, and we're going to get more, I'm told, and online. We expected a cozy little fireside chat, but I am so looking forward to doing it with those of you in the room, and it looks like we may have several hundred who've registered online. My name is Maya Prabhu. I'm an associate professor here at Yale Medical School. I'm in the Division of Law and Psychiatry, and I also have a cross appointment as a clinical faculty at the law school. And my particular area of interest is in working with resettled refugees and displaced populations, and particularly thinking of, is it not working on? All right, can you hear me better now? That is working. Can you hear me if I lean forward into the mic? People are looking dubious. All right, we'll start again. Welcome, and it's a pleasure to have you here. Oh, I can even hear that better. All right, and for those of you on Zoom, pleasure to have you as well. I promise you as Zoom audience members, we won't forget you either. So I invite you to chat in where you're from and what your particular interest on climate migration is, because we're always interested in knowing who our audience is. My name is Maya Prabhu, an associate professor in the in the School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry. I have a longstanding interest in working with displaced populations and resettled refugees, and I've worked for over a decade also with their legal teams who are working with individual asylum seekers and refugees, both domestically and abroad. And we have primarily, this talk today is going to be about the legal challenges and the legal dimensions of climate migration, but we'll let the discussion unfold, and perhaps the audience will let me indulge myself with a couple of thoughts also about the psychosocial needs and the mental health needs of displaced populations and the implications of climate migration. But let's have a little Q&A first. I think I'm so excited to have our two speakers here. They have deep expertise in legal issues and challenges with regard to climate migration. Alexandra Harrington, can you see us? Or she will be joining us perhaps online. Is there a way that we can pull up her photo? Alex and Sumudu, I will tell you about them while we pull up their photos. So Alexandra Harrington is at Lancaster University Law School. She is the chair of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law Agreement on Plastics and the director of studies for the International Law Association of Colombia, and has recently served as the Fulbright Canada Research Chair in Global Governance. She has authored International Organizations in the Law, International Law, and Global Governance, and she routinely advises our organizations and governments on legal issues relating to climate change, governance, and environmental law. Welcome, Alex. And Alex will be talking to us a little bit about issues around state sovereignty and the particular implications for indigenous populations and climate migration. And I see Sumudu on the screen. Pleasure to see you, Sumudu. Also a colleague of mine. Sumudu is the director of research centers of the Research Center and senior lecturer at the University of Wisconsin Law School. She teaches in the area of international environmental law and climate change, as well as affiliated faculty at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Sweden. Actually, Sumudu has many international affiliations, and I'll let her describe them as she chooses to in the course of her talk. She has written on human rights approaches to climate change, challenges and opportunities in international environmental law, and she has also published widely in the field of international environmental law and climate change. And so Sumudu will be particularly addressing the legal challenges around humanitarian and human rights and climate justice issues related to climate migration. So welcome, Alex and Sumudu. It's nice to see you both online. All right, so here's our plan for today. How many of you are lawyers or legally trained or feel like they're comfortable in the language of law? Okay, so a couple of people, welcome. And perhaps the rest of you are better off without. By the way, I note that we have a very special delegation today from the Foote School. Do you want to wave or make yourself known? Or they were here, they might come back. So we have a special delegation thinking about young activists and students interested in climate issues. So our plan for today is I will do a very brief overview of some of the big issues and sort of put out the lay of the land on climate migration. And then Sumudu will segue to Sumudu, who'll talk about humanitarian and human rights issues. Then we'll segue to Alex, who'll speak a little bit about the sovereignty issues, and then we'll move to a Q&A. So our intent is not to speak at the top for more than about 18 minutes so that you can ask your questions, and then we'll let the discussion unfold, and then I will maybe throw in some comments around the mental health issues. Does that seem fair to everyone? And I invite the people on Zoom to put in your questions in the chat. We're very happy to take them either as we go along or as it makes sense over the course of the discussion. So let me share and a quick overview. So what do we mean by climate migration? Who is a climate migrant? And I'll begin by saying even that term, climate migrant, is a complicated and contested term. You will hear the phrase climate refugee, environmental refugee, climate-induced displacement, and so on. And for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to use the word climate migrant and sort of recognize that the term actually matters as we go on to think about what their rights are and what our protections should be and what obligations we have to them. So just a question for those people in the audience. We're sitting here in New Haven. How many of you were born and raised in New Haven? Not one? One hometown crowd? Fair enough. How many of you were born in the same place that your parents were born? A couple of people, but a smaller group. So what's the point I'm trying to make here? Most of us have migrant stories, personal migrant stories or family migrant stories. The human race, we're a peripatetic group. 2% of the world's population is on the move for a whole bunch of reasons, for livelihood, for escaping persecution and violence, for economic opportunities, for educational opportunities. So I think it's important to recognize that even as we're talking about this phenomenon of climate migration, it's against the backdrop of people, of human beings constantly on the move. And people have always moved for environmental reasons as well, for seasonal reasons, to escape flooding, to escape drought, to look at longstanding changes, to seek out different opportunities and livelihoods that are sort of eroding and fading. But climate migration, you can consider that a subset of environmental migrants, and they're individuals who are forced to leave or seek to leave due to sudden or gradual alterations in the natural environment. And the three phenomena that we think about the most are climate-related events such as sea level rise, extreme weather events, think hurricanes, typhoons, think perhaps even wildfires, and drought and water scarcity. So it's a complex term that has many typologies in it, and that's part of the reason why it's so hard to talk about. What is the scale that we're talking about? Well, that's also complicated because who's vulnerable is going to be very susceptible in what happens with the climate trajectory. But the numbers that we're talking about, the most commonly cited number is about 200 million by the year 2050. And we're looking at, when we look at just people who are moving within countries, so people we call internally displaced, the World Bank in its excellent 2018 groundswell report has sort of estimated that maybe 143 million are going to be displaced alone by 2050. 143 million people. Where do they go? Who takes them in? How do they meet their needs? How do they meet their survival needs? And what happens to the communities that are now facing this influx of persons with tremendous needs who may be forced to move for reasons entirely out of their control? And it's also worth saying that we know that some regions of the world are going to be affected more than others: Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. One of the reasons why it's so challenging to talk about climate migration is because migration is, people leave for what we call push and pull factors. It's a multivariable, multifactorial issue. Not everyone leaves after a catastrophe. Not even people leave when the general context of the environment changes. So we call those push-pull factors. They're very individual. It changes by family. And it's worth stating that there are always people who are going to stay. We call these populations trapped populations, and they may be, in fact, the population of greatest concern to us because they're vulnerable. They can't move because of illness, disability, other political or social vulnerabilities. So all of which to say, we're talking about a very varied group of people. And so thinking about what their needs and their rights and are is a complicated one. Much to say about how climate migration has become a much more significant issue at the international level, but I wanted to point out a couple of worrying lines from the more recent IPCC report. So 2018 reports noted that one of the biggest challenges of extreme weather events is the simultaneous likelihood of multiple simultaneous events occurring at the same time. So in a single country, you might have a wildfire and floods, a wildfire and heat extremes. And so what that means is countries, which, including ours, which might be struggling to overcome infrastructure challenges or infrastructure stressors, are now going to have to be dealing with infrastructure challenges at multiple types. And that means populations on the move for multiple reasons, even within countries. How do we meet people's needs? And we've already seen this, particularly in the United States in the last couple of years. And you only need to click open to the Weather Channel app to see how this is affecting countries abroad. By far, when we think about climate migration, the situation of small island states who are particularly vulnerable to rising seawaters and the erosion of their coastlines is probably the most critical issue, or should be the most critical issue, when we think about international obligations. And Sumudu and Alex are both going to be talking about issues about what happens to states when they no longer physically exist, and what does the global north owe the global south, or countries that have been made most vulnerable, and not because they're contributing significantly to the underlying causes of climate change. Some events, such as these slow onset events, droughtification, unfortunately sort of overlap or coincide with other complex humanitarian emergencies. So violence, political strife, instability, often sort of combine with longer standing climate issues, which also drives population in large numbers. Does anyone recognize this photo? Take a guess. You're welcome. It's Katrina. That's right. I heard Katrina being called out. So this was, I'm sure, not the first climate event in the United States, but it may have been the first time that a single significant event, the impact and the intensity of Hurricane Katrina is thought to have been significant in contributing to the overwhelming waters, as we know, ended up overwhelming sort of the Katrina levee offenses. It took over a decade for Katrina to begin to truly rebuild and have population move back. In that single event alone, over 1 million people left the sort of New Orleans area. And it just shows you the intensity that a single event can have in terms of population movements. Somebody called out, I think, Hurricane Sandy. Yes, I'm just thinking about things that affected us locally. And these are photographs from Hurricane Irene. And you can get a sense of how devastating a single event is. And of course, Puerto Rico has been hit again. But Hurricane Irene led to an exodus of 500,000 people from Puerto Rico to the mainland. And this is just the beginning. So one of the takeaways that I want you to understand is that climate migration is already happening. It's already started. And the question is really now how we respond. Last photographs for me. Does anyone recognize either of these photographs? The issue of planned relocation, communities already having to think about moving, is already occurring, even here in the United States. The top photo is a photograph of Ile St. Charles, which is a community in Louisiana that has already been in the process of moving for the past 20 years, planned relocation away from the coastline due to the salination of the coastline, and you can see the flooding land there. And yet it has received very little attention. The bottom photograph is a community in Alaska, also an indigenous community that is already in the middle of a planned relocation. So again, I wanted to sort of emphasize that these are existing events and existing scenarios, and we're only beginning now to think about the legal needs and challenges that we have to think about. I'll just sort of comment that urbanization is closely linked to climate migration internally, and hopefully we'll talk a little bit about those particular needs and complexities. So I'm going to pause and put my own PowerPoint on hold for a second and invite Sumudu. Perhaps you can pick up where I left off and talk a little bit about the global humanitarian and human rights and justice concerns. And then we'll move to Alex and begin our discussion. So I'll step down there and help monitor the conversation in the chat. So thank you, Sumudu.
Thank you so much, Maya, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here today. So I do have a few slides. Let me see that I can share my slides. Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as Maya said, I'm going to talk about climate migration, human rights, and climate justice. Before I do that, I want to take a step back and discuss climate migration in the context of global inequity, because you might think, oh, what is the connection, right? I think if we don't really see the connections, we cannot really address the issue, because otherwise it'll be like putting a Band-Aid without actually, treating the problem. So you may have heard this, that just 26 people, individuals, control more wealth in this world than 3.6 billion people put together. Just let that sink in for a minute. This is from Oxfam. I didn't make this up. So half the population in the world controls as much wealth as just 26 billionaires in this world. And this astounding inequity is not a coincidence. It's the result of centuries of colonial domination, subordination, racial inequity, racism, plunder of these natural resources of the colonized that led to this situation, as well as the laws and institutions that made this possible, right? And we know that climate change is inextricably linked to capitalism. So think about it, because we are trying to address climate change within the same system. And I feel that that's a very short-sighted approach. Again, it's the Band-Aid mentality, because we are not actually addressing the root causes. And if you look at the hotspots for climate migration, Maya mentioned them, like South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. These are former colonies. So can you see the connections here? So I want, oops, sorry, let me go to the slideshow. Sorry, that's better. Okay, so if you look at this, think about the inequality that I mentioned just now and the connection to the CO2 emissions in the world. The richest 10% is responsible for almost half lifestyle consumption emissions, whereas the poorest 50% that also controls, together the same wealth as just 26 individuals, they are responsible only for 10%, right? So again, you can see the disproportionate impact or disproportionate contribution of these different groups, these two different groups to climate change. And then you can see the vulnerability, which is the flip side of the contributions. So you can see the vulnerability is Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Again, former colonies. So the disproportionate, the injustice of climate change is that those who contributed least to the problem are going to be affected most. And this is connected to climate migration as well. And these are the hotspots for climate migration, because these places are becoming impossible to live. And I don't mean to say that climate change is not affecting the rest of the world. And my next slide is Alaska, actually. These communities are forced to move because of climate change. Again, you will see that these are indigenous communities. Their contribution to climate change is pretty minimal compared to the rest of us. So there are communities in the global north that are affected as well, disproportionately affected, as well as communities in the global south that are disproportionately affected. So their contribution compared to the consequences is very little. So this is a village of Kivalina, and scientists believe that this village will be underwater by 2025, which is not very far away. And they still have not been relocated. A place has not been found, and people are still talking about who is going to pay for this. And this is the richest country in the world, and we are still talking about money. Again, another village in Alaska that voted to relocate, and I believe they are still awaiting relocation as well. And then, of course, Bangladesh, which is a very, geographically, it's very vulnerable. Then, of course, there's a whole heap of other issues that come into play as well. So I will just get into some of the points that Maya made, that people have always moved. I'm a migrant myself. I was born in Sri Lanka. Now I live in the United States. But I didn't really come here for climate reasons. So why is climate migration so special or significant, right? Maya mentioned the numbers, the sheer magnitude of the issue. And then Alex will talk about the impact on small island states. We are facing a situation where about 50 sovereign nations might disappear from the face of the earth, right? And I talked about the disproportionate impact on certain groups and countries. So climate migration is considered as a form of adaptation, an extreme one, but that ignores this group of people that Maya referred to as trap populations. Because some people cannot move even if they want to for reasons of poverty, social factors, age, disability, cultural issues. So we have to address that situation at the same time addressing the situation of climate refugees or climate migration. So there are so many different challenges, legal challenges, social challenges, financial challenges. As I mentioned earlier, we are still talking about Alaska, this little village, the Kivalina, in Alaska, and who is going to pay for that? And imagine how countries like Bangladesh are going to address the financial challenge. Then human rights and humanitarian challenge. As we know, when people move, many of their rights are in jeopardy. Many of them end up in refugee camps. Their freedom of movement is affected. So is the right to education, right to a livelihood, right to culture. You might be leaving everything you have and going to a place where you know nothing of. You might not even know the language. So imagine starting your life from scratch. So you're a whole heap of rights, a whole range of rights would be affected as a result of the movement. And then the sheer numbers, I mean, this is a humanitarian crisis. And added to that, we have other complexities like conflict, poverty, marginalization, racialization. So all these complexities intersect with one another. So we need to look at these issues holistically. I will take a few minutes to talk about the legal challenges, and I will hand over to Alex. One of the problems that we face with climate migration is that we don't even have a legal definition of that, let alone a legal framework to cover them. There are some frameworks at the international level, but there's nothing to cover climate migration if people cross international borders, because the current legal framework applies to political refugees. So you have to establish that you are being persecuted by your own state due to various reasons like political opinion, place of birth, and things like that. The Geneva Convention on Refugees embodies the legal framework, and it's a very, very strict definition of refugees. And we know how countries, in addition, of course, the countries might have their own definition, which is even stricter. So climate refugees, people who cross international borders due to climate change are not covered by this definition. There is an interesting decision from the Human Rights Committee that said in extreme cases, climate change could pose a serious risk to life, and therefore you could be considered as a refugee, but that's a very, very strict definition, and the standard that the Human Rights Committee adopted was pretty high, but it gives some hope that there is some avenue for these people. But that's one area that we as lawyers, we really need to look at. So I will hand over to Alex, who will talk more about the larger issues relating to sovereignty and statehood. Thank you.
While Alex is setting up, I'll simply say, at the beginning, I said I'm going to use the term climate migration rather than climate migrant, and definitely not use the term climate refugee. And just to pick up, it was part because of what Sumudu just alluded to, which is despite the fact that if you read a newspaper article, you'll often see the term climate refugee as a kind of shorthand. As Sumudu says, the current convention, which defines who is a refugee, is very much built around political persecution and the failure of states to protect their own people based on very specific criteria: race, social group, political activities. And so the concern is that if we were to open up the convention, the current convention on refugees, it would in fact end up diluting the current protections for those individuals who are facing political persecution, or that at the current time and the current climate, it would be impossible to come to any terms and international terms and an international agreement on what the content of what of the new convention. So it would end up in disarray and end up diluting the current protections for current political refugees. So much of the discussion, and Alex is going to talk about this, is what sort of legal frameworks are needed, both domestically, regionally, and internationally, that particularly addresses the needs of climate refugees or climate migrants. And particularly given how hard it is to define who a climate migrant is, how do we think about what political framework should contain them and protect them? Sorry, Alex, I hope I gave you a second to set up.
Oh, absolutely. So I will now share my screen. I didn't want to share it while you were talking and have you cut off and become a PowerPoint for people online. So let me just share this now. And thank you all. And thank you all so much for joining in person, online. I do wish that I could actually be in the room, and seeing Maya makes me very sad that I'm not in the same room with her, but I'm in the UK, so that would have been a little bit difficult. So what I want to talk about briefly is this idea of statehood and sovereignty, as well as Indigenous community issues that are really quite at the forefront of legal responses to climate migration and to many of the issues and challenges that we have seen come up with climate migration responses thus far. I am grateful to Maya for doing the poll of who has background in this and who doesn't. So I will explain in as concise a fashion as possible the basic parameters behind statehood, et cetera, and where they come from, to give you a bit of a perspective on that. And then obviously, if there are questions, please do feel free to ask them as you would like. When we think of a state, first of all, to backtrack 1 second, many of you will be used to the idea of a state being a US state of Connecticut, et cetera, and then countries or nations being what we talk about when we talk about another country, another place outside of the US, outside of our own home country. In international law, we use the terminology of states and statehood. So when we're talking about statehood, please do kind of remember that in your mind. It's always a bit of a challenge, especially for those studying in the US, to remember some of the terminology, but it is quite key. And when we're thinking of actors in the international community, the most important thing to remember is that states are at the pinnacle. They are at the very highest level of international law. States make international law. They create the legal system. They are the ones that ratify treaties. They are the ones that decide perhaps not to ratify treaties, et cetera. So while we are quite fortunately in many views, including my own, seeing a real kind of influx of individual and group knowledge and place in many different aspects of international law, it is quite dominated by states. And this is important for many reasons, including understanding who can be an actor, who can vote, who can adopt laws, who can shape them, and who can't. So what is a state? We have 4 essential factors. Now, there are many arguments that there are other types of factors. There are many arguments that this is a bit outdated. But what we do have comes from a convention called the Montevideo Convention, which was ratified in the early part of the 1900s, and it sets 4 essential criteria. So what are these 4 criteria? You have to have a defined piece of territory. It doesn't have to be big, it can be quite small. This is important, as we'll get to momentarily. You have to have a permanent population. It doesn't mean that everyone who is identified as being part of your population when you're seeking to become a state stays. They can come, they can go. Migration is assumed even in this. But your population essentially can't be nomadic, and it does have to have some core that's always in the territory. You have to have an effective government. Your government must actually be able to govern the territory and the people it supposedly has control over. And you must have international capacity. And usually this is the most problematic prong. It typically, for a political perspective, is where we see arguments about otherwise qualifying entities not becoming recognized as states because there is not an international will to have them in the community, thus international capacity fails. Please note that these are each required elements. If you fail on one prong, you fail on all of them. So this is why we have seen, again, some states or some claiming states fail quite often, quite repeatedly. The Palestinian applications that keep going in will fail repeatedly thus far because of international capacity. So it does play a great role in many ways. And these decisions are made now largely by the UN. Before we had the UN, it was slightly different. But now that we have the UN, it is regarded as the largest imprimatur of statehood. And there is a formal process for becoming a member of the UN. That process requires the recognition of statehood. If you do not qualify, your application, first of all, goes to the Secretary General, who passes it on to the Security Council. If the Security Council believes you should be a state, then it goes to the General Assembly, and then there is a vote, yay or nay. Most of the time, the issue never gets to the General Assembly, but this is how we do have this as a procedure. Once you are a state, you are a state. Congratulations, this is a wonderful thing. This means that you have sovereignty, and you have recognized sovereignty in the international community. And sovereignty is best understood as internal and external. And internally, this is very important, it relates to migration. Internal control means migration control. Controls of policies as to who can be a citizen, who can't, who can come in, who can't, how long can they come in for. This is why we have each country having its own immigration laws and practices rather than one large set of practices. At the same time, we have an external element, which means that even if we don't necessarily agree with them, all other states will respect the laws and the borders of any other state in the system. So it's an internal and an external element, and both of these come into place in the migrant discussion, especially climate migration. So if you have a state, it's recognized, this is wonderful, you have sovereignty. We have some states that are quite new, we have some states that are quite old. But once you are a state, typically, historically, you exist unless you are dissolved. For example, for those of you who remember or have studied Czechoslovakia as a country, it dissolved volitionally into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, or Czechia, depending on the terminology being used. or through warfare. And warfare was really the other way that we traditionally had states no longer exist. The issue of states ceasing to exist because they physically don't have a territory is something that has never been addressed by the international community before. It really was never contemplated before. However, climate change is forcing us to rethink this. And as Sumudu discussed and provided quite compelling images of, this will be changing. It's already changing. It will continue to change. And we know that we will have a number of states that are facing issues where they don't have territory. From a strictly international law perspective, which can sometimes seem quite harsh in many ways, we don't have an answer. We have no precedent. And there have been some very interesting examples of states trying to conceive of what will happen to us and how do we take preventive steps to move along. So one of the things that we have seen is an effort by several years ago by the Maldives to relocate and to try to purchase land. The countries approached were Australia, Sri Lanka, and India to purchase land to which the state could relocate itself and its populations when it was no longer inhabitable. Government that had been trying to do this was ousted from office for other reasons, and this was never really taken up again. But it was something that has started a lot of debate as to what will happen when inevitably, as we know, states will lose their territory. It will either completely be underwater or it will be uninhabitable. And then we have large numbers of people who cannot live in their homes, cannot live in their home states, will have to go somewhere. And the question is, where do they go? Do they continue to have citizenship? Because if you lose territory, then potentially you lose statehood, and thus the citizenship of those who had been your citizens would go away or would be in flux, which contravenes the convention and subsequent protocols that we have on statelessness and making it illegal in international law to be a state. There are also issues of the obligations of states if they do have large numbers of people coming to them from now no longer potentially existing states due to climate change, and we don't have answers. And the idea of how do we reconstitute a state if we can? These are all very open questions, but they're questions that as I was reflecting to my husband this morning, I had been talking about for a very long period of time, and we still don't have answers to, but increasingly the clock is ticking to the point where we will need something. And a final thought to leave you with is this question of indigenous communities, especially in small island developing states, sovereignty and climate migration. We have seen for a number of years, and we continue to see it in human rights treaties, et cetera, a discussion of sovereignty that is both internal and external for indigenous communities as well. So typically, indigenous communities will have a larger degree of sovereignty and latitude internally. When we think, for example, of First Nations communities in Canada or indigenous populations in the US, Native American populations in the US, where they have on reservations in their own territories a great deal more latitude, but they're still subject to the jurisdiction and citizenship of the US or of Canada. This will become more problematic when we have states that are actually primarily composed of indigenous populations, such as those in the South Pacific, who are no longer able to be in their home territories and who become climate migrants, whether it is all at once in a mass event or whether it is over time. Because not only are we thinking of what passport do we give them, what nationality do we give them, we also need to start thinking about what makes us have special areas for indigenous communities in general internally. And that links to the idea which Sumudu raised of cultural heritage issues, identity issues, being able to stay together as a community when migrating. So rather than individuals migrating, collective migration, et cetera. So these are all issues that are very much coming up. They have human rights implications. They have international law implications. They have environmental implications, et cetera. and are open, which hopefully is not only something that gives you a sense of what is out there in terms of these issues, but also for those of you who are students might get some interest going and might have some of you come into these discussions and in the future help us try to figure them out. So I will stop talking at this point. Thank you very much. Should you have any questions, please do feel free to email me. But I will stop sharing my screen at this point so that hopefully we can have some questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex and Sumudu. So now that we have thoroughly demoralized you, but I hope not, because I think what we're trying to lay out here is the range of research areas, scholarship areas, collaboration areas, not just around law, but around field work on working with communities and thinking about their local needs and their humanitarian needs. Let's open the floor and the virtual audience to questions. Questions, thoughts, comments? We'll start here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your presentations. So from my experience working with some of the communities that you mentioned in Alaska, is that they've started to think about their relocation as expansion, because often when you claim that you're going to relocate or move, there'll be a disinvestment in the current community site, and you mentioned this with trapped population. So my question is about how can we keep in mind the needs of people who will still be there and be able to provide those services, and if there's any legal implications of that?
Alex or Sumudu, why don't we start with the second half of the question around the legal implications of when you have an expanded nation or an expanded community, and then I'll maybe add a few thoughts about meeting the humanitarian and social needs.
Thank you for that question. One of the issues has been actually finding a proper place for that is acceptable both for the moving community as well as the host community. And it's very important to have consultations in this situation, providing proper information to both parties. And consulting with them, and also when it comes to indigenous populations, there's an additional requirement, a higher standard that we have to meet, which is the free, prior, and informed consent, particularly if you are being moved from their traditional lands. So consulting with both groups is a very important thing. You cannot just take a group, however small they are, however small the numbers are, you cannot just go and put them somewhere and just forget about them. You have to provide the necessary infrastructure, the necessary facilities, schooling, livelihoods, and things like that. And this is one of the issues with the small island states, for example, because these are communities, many of them are coastal communities. They engage in fishing. So you cannot really go and put them in the middle of like a desert or something, even if there is space for them to live. And this is what's happening with most relocations, that we forget about them. We just put them somewhere because we have to move them physically. And then there's no infrastructure, no running water and things like that. So yeah, it's a complex process, but consulting with the groups every step of the way, I think is the way to go.
Alex?
Oh, no, absolutely. I completely agree. And it's something that we also have to think about in short term and in long term. And too often it's quite easy to think about the short term. There is an immediate existential issue, so we will move you somewhere and then leave you. And whether that's inside the US as in Alaska or whether it's internationally, the issue then becomes you move on to the next pressing problem and you don't put things in place for the long term. So we really do, when we have things like free, prior, and informed consent discussions and consultations, we do really have to make sure that that's part of it. Definitely.
I'll just sort of add to that. One of the challenges is I don't think that we've thought deep enough about the impact of moving communities into the impact on receiving communities when you have displaced persons for whatever reason who move into the community. How many of you were around in the past few years when we had huge influxes of people from other cities during COVID moving into Connecticut, moving into other parts of the United States? If you look at the maps, you saw a tremendous migration internally for reasons that have nothing to do with climate, but have to do with distress. Lots of political pressures, lots of political anxieties. How do you meet schools? How do you meet infrastructure? How do you meet urban planning needs? And imagine that being writ large for communities that might not even be your own, that might be perceived as outsiders who are encroaching on scarce resources. There's a national security literature and lots of national security white papers that talk about climate change, right? Being in climate migration, being an amplifier for security risks and for conflicts, particularly in resource limited areas. And of course, both Sumudu and Alex use the term we and you, which is, but who is the we? When you move an island state or think about a planned relocation, for example, as the island of Kiribati did, what does it mean to buy land elsewhere? How does receiving territory feel about an entirely different community taking space on their soil? Is that a permanent arrangement? I don't know that there has been adequate discussion of that. And maybe I'll just throw this to Sumudu and Alex. We're coming up to a COP. So a meeting of the parties around the UNFCCC convention. Can you maybe talk about whether any of these issues or how these issues are on that international agenda and how they will play a part in these upcoming international negotiations?
I will just say that the sovereignty issue, loss of statehood, those, at least to my knowledge, have not been part of the official negotiations. Small island states have been pushing for a long time to get these issues on the table. They have succeeded to some extent, for example, by getting the loss and damage mechanism included in the Paris Agreement, which looks at both slow damage caused by slow onset events like sea level rise, as well as sudden events like severe weather events. But loss of statehood implicates a lot of other legal issues, as Alex pointed out, like losing your nationality. Even if we sort of solve the statehood problem, because after all, statehood is a legal fiction that we created, right? I'm sure the smart lawyers in the room, the budding lawyers as well, can come up with another legal fiction to address the situation. But what about the humanitarian issue? Where are these people going to go, right? We are talking about almost 50 different nations. So that issue has not been looked at either, although after many, many years, almost 25 years of negotiations, a task force was established to study the issue of climate migration, but they have not really proposed a new legal framework. They have not addressed, I know the OHCHR, the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights, had a panel discussion about small island states and disappearance of states, but to my knowledge, this has not been part of the official negotiations. So Alex might be able to add more to that.
No, it absolutely has not. And the focus really has been, ever since the Paris Agreement, on the idea of loss and damage, the idea of trying to recognize what this will be, provide financial assistance, provide potentially insurance where the insurers would not otherwise provide insurance, basically seeing it as an economic problem and potentially having an economic solution. And in terms of how various communities are being encouraged to address it, it really goes back to the idea of adaptation and mitigation and nothing further, which is interesting because we're also starting to see, and this has actually been something that has been advocated by those from these small island developing states and developing countries generally. We're starting to see much more climate change litigation. And it's coming not only in the larger states that we associated with, such as the Netherlands with the Agenda case, or those of you who have studied the never-ending Juliana case in the US will be well aware. I think many of you in the room were probably quite young when it started, and it still kind of goes on in various formats. But a number of states that are facing very imminent threat from climate change are starting to use climate litigation against not only their own governments, individuals against their own governments, but also against other governments, in order to try to find a larger solution and to press on many of the issues that have not been resolved at prior COPs, at prior conferences of the parties, in the loss and damage mechanism. And so we shall see. Loss and damage is a very high ranking item on the agenda for COP27, but we'll see what happens. That is not a guarantee of anything other than it being discussed.
Yeah, and if I may add, even with loss and damage, states have been, the major emitters have been very reluctant to put money on the table. And that goes to the disproportionate sort of contribution to climate change that I was talking about. What is the responsibility of these major emitters to help the countries like small island states who are going to lose everything they have to the point of being obliterated from the face of the earth, right? I mean, are we going to let that happen is the question. And from what I see, apparently we are going to let that happen. So think about that.
We have a question over here in the room.
Thank you very much. Yesterday, we heard from a number of representatives from small island states, and they really made the point that there is already so much inaction on climate adaptation that I'm just wondering, and part of that, I think, and they seem to agree when we were talking afterward, really has to do with an unwillingness, a collective unwillingness to acknowledge what they have already acknowledged, which is that there will be an overshoot, that climate change is already here, and that as we continue to push forward on mitigation, we have got to invest in adaptation. And given the global lack of action on adaptation, what is your optimism or hopefulness that there will be enough forethought on these very important legal issues ahead of time? Or is there also the risk that really we just don't want to acknowledge that this is here, this is happening, and in some cases, even if we do all the mitigation, it is irreversible, at least in the course of our lifetimes? Do you have optimism that we can acknowledge those facts and therefore move forward toward action, or really that's going to continue to be a barrier toward inaction? And then just one last question, you may have no answer to this at all, but I'm just wondering if there's been any thought given at all to the possibility of displaced populations leaving, even for a generation or so, having to, and then through adaptation, through mitigation, et cetera, returning in 100 years, in 150 years to their original territory. I mean, what happens under those circumstances? Those are two very different questions.
Wow.
Well, Alex and Sumudu, I'll give you a second to ponder that, but maybe because I see that we're coming up to time, and those are very interesting questions.
Yeah.
I'll just ask if anybody else has another question, and we'll put that on the table. If not, we'll each get a go. We have one question over there.
Thank you. I think my question is related to how do we need to rethink migration frameworks, especially because I feel like the big players like states are not the ones that should be playing a big role. I feel like most of the requirements that governments ask for people to migrate around, like visas, are very challenging, and they are not recognizing that, for example, climate change is just breaking apart the migration framework for more countries. Also because in some states, in some countries, migration can be as huge as the sum of 7 or 10 countries just migrated, among them. And finally, I think that the idea of people just not being freely to go from one country or another country, not just demands a lot of effort, energy, and money from there for, like just moving around, but also limits our way to understand humanity. So maybe the way to understand and to kind of have an opportunity to rethink migration is thanks to climate change. Because when you are affected and you don't have a country, you don't have a territory, then you kind of need to be supported for whoever is around you. And for that, you shouldn't be requested to have a visa or something else. And proof of that was COVID. Peru didn't ask any visa to our friends in Venezuela. We opened our borders even before COVID for them, like several countries did for us in the 80s. So maybe climate change will help us, and I would like your opinion on that, to rethink these kind of crazy frameworks.
Thank you. So we have questions regarding international and regional legal frameworks, and then a visionary question about what if, can we imagine a plan that thinks 120 years out, 150 years out, during which time we think about rebuilding, reframing, thinking about how we can adapt local communities or what's existing of remains of communities so that people can return. So Sumudu and Alex, why don't you start, and then I'll throw in some thoughts about humanitarian needs and medical and social needs.
Maya, there's a question in the Q&A as well.
Okay.
So I'll start with rethinking migration frameworks because I think obviously we need to rethink migration frameworks because, as I pointed out, there is a legal lacuna when it comes to climate migration if people cross international borders. But we also know that most migration will take place internally, but even with internal migration, we are not equipped to deal with the numbers. So in the same way that we look at international migration, we also need to look at internal migration, whether we can facilitate internal migration in a much more smooth manner. And then at the same time, think about how to adopt a legal framework to protect the rights of those who migrate across borders. Opening borders without visas, whatever the legal requirements are, I don't see that happening without being forced to do so. Because I think in, 10, 15, or maybe 50 years time, borders might, if we don't do anything, borders might become superfluous because people will move, whether there's a legal framework or not, because if there's danger, if you cannot live in a particular place, people don't think about the legal frameworks, they just move, and you have seen that happen, right? The legal aspects come later. So we need to rethink, and I must mention the Nansen framework, which has been adopted, a soft law, not a binding framework, but over 100 countries, I think, have signed on to it. That is the only framework that currently governs those who move across borders, but only due to disasters. So that framework is confined to disasters. So those who are moving as a result of sea level rise, for example, won't be covered by that. But at least we have that framework in place. So we really need to think about that. Big players should not be playing a role, but we need to be pragmatic here. It is the big players who have deep pockets, and we do need money to facilitate this. We need finance. and there's no getting around that. And we need some countries to be altruistic and open borders, but to what extent that will happen, I don't know. And the other point I want to make quickly is about adaptation versus mitigation, because there has been a lot of sort of back and forth on this, whether you put money to mitigation or to adaptation. We need both, obviously, but what we need to remember is adaptation is now, right? Whatever the plans you put in place is for the current generation and maybe for the next generation. The mitigation measures we put in place is for our children and grandchildren. So we are talking about two different timeframes, and we need both. It's not either or, it's both. So I'll just mention that. I don't know about coming back. It all depends on geography too. If these places become habitable again, if they might, we don't know, but the projections are that, you know, they will disappear. So if it is possible for them to come back, that'll be great. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you. And it would be wonderful. I don't know that it would be. And we also have to remember that there is a great deal of personal choice in any type of migration. And so whether in 100 years you would be able to go back to a place where at that point it would be your grandchildren or your grandparents or great grandparents came from, and whether you would want to go back, two very different questions. I absolutely agree with Sumudu's point about needing to have both frameworks for adaptation and mitigation and not give primacy to one over the other, because without doing both, you really are not going to have a sustainable future. In terms of the immigration issues, I think it would be wonderful to find a way to get people to be able to move to wherever they feel is best for them. Unfortunately, pragmatically, I think that will not be possible. But Sumudu raised a very interesting point, and that is that people, especially those who are in desperate situations, will move, will migrate, and fill out the paperwork later and worry about those issues later. And that will also cause us to have to question the idea of non-refoulement, because the idea of non-refoulement, for those of you who haven't heard of it, in 2 seconds before Maya kills me, it's the idea that you cannot send someone back to their home state if there is a reasonable belief that they will be subject to torture or other types of persecution. If that is the case now, when we're talking about a civil issue and a political issue, we will need to rethink the definition of non-refoulement to, if you're going to send someone back to an island that is completely underwater, that would then need to be looked at as a potential form of, yes, your life would probably be deprived. So it will require us to challenge not only the idea of refugee, but also much of our concepts of migration law and refugee and asylum law at this point. Maya, I'm sorry.
Alex, actually, if I can, I can add to that, that was the basis on which the Human Rights Committee recognized climate change as being as posing a serious threat to life, that you may not be sent back because of the principle of non-refoulement. Yeah.
So I think we should try to come back next year and continue to discuss these issues. As you can see, we've only begun to lay out the issues, and this question of solutions, creative solutions. By the way, I think the answer is going to be in local and regional frameworks. I don't think that the international system is functioning well enough to be able to come up with a convention or a framework convention that is binding, and the answer is going to have to be found in regionally negotiated solutions, labor passes, free movement associations, and the question of how to meet the humanitarian needs of what will be millions of people is going to be a real challenge. The truth is that COVID has shown us how fragile and precarious our most basic public infrastructures in all domains are. So that's and there's no way to address any of that without scaling up financing on a level that we have not seen in any country. So I will sit here and happily answer any further questions from anyone who wants to hang out. I will let the rest of you enjoy your lunch. Alex and Sumudu, colleagues of mine from the Center for International Sustainable Development Law in Montreal, as well as long friends. What a pleasure to see you. Thank you for joining us in New Haven today. And thank you to everybody online as well. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Be well.